The air of the late 19th century in America was thick with the scent of coal smoke, crude oil, and, most potently, unprecedented wealth. The decades following the Civil War, optimistically dubbed the Gilded Age by Mark Twain, were a period of dazzling, superficial prosperity that masked a deeper core of ruthless ambition and stark inequality. Out of this chaotic industrial boom emerged a new class of potentates, the Tycoons, men who, through sheer force of will, innovation, and often morally ambiguous practices, amassed fortunes that dwarfed those of European aristocracy and redefined the very concept of American power. They were not born to titles, but they commanded an influence greater than any king. They were the new royalty. The transformation began not in the hallowed halls of government, but in the gritty, churning heart of industry. The nation was a vast, unmapped economic frontier, ripe for monopolization. Men like John D. Rockefeller saw not just oil in the Pennsylvania earth, but the potential to control every single step of its journey from the wellhead to the lamp. He didn't just build a company, he built Standard Oil, a colossal machine of efficiency and vertical integration that systematically crushed all competitors. His genius was not in invention, but in organization, eliminating waste with an almost maniacal dedication until he controlled an estimated 90% of America's oil refining capacity. His wealth became so immense that the U.S. government itself seemed a lesser entity by comparison. Meanwhile, on the steel frontiers, Andrew Carnegie, an immigrant from Scotland, applied the same relentless logic to the burgeoning railroad and construction industries. Recognizing that steel, not iron, was the future backbone of America, he built the largest integrated steel company in the world. Carnegie's philosophy was simple, yet brutal. Put all your eggs in one basket, and then watch that basket. This single-minded focus made him the master of the Bessemer process and the architect of skyscrapers and bridges across the nation. He was a paradox, a literary man who championed libraries, yet a ruthless operator who kept his workers in near-slavery conditions to minimize production costs. The scale of his operations was unimaginable. His sale of Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for over $480 million in 1901 was, at the time, the largest industrial deal in history, cementing his place in the pantheon of the super-rich. Then there was Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt, the undisputed king of transportation. Starting in shipping, he pivoted masterfully to the emerging railroad industry, seeing the future in connecting the disparate markets of the continent. Vanderbilt was a shrewd, unapologetic autocrat. He consolidated competing rail lines, often through aggressive, take-no-prisoners financial tactics, until he held a virtual stranglehold over vital arteries of American commerce. His power was so absolute that when the New York Central needed a bridge across the Hudson, he simply built it. Demonstrating that these men did not ask permission, they created the rules. Finally, orchestrating the entire financial symphony from his Wall Street fortress was J.P. Morgan. Morgan was not an industrialist, but a financier, a man who saw money itself as the most valuable commodity. He brokered the massive deals, stabilized markets, and at times plunged them into panic, and reorganized entire industries, including rescuing the U.S. government during a financial crisis in 1895. He used his immense banking capital to fund the giants, creating the trusts and corporations that became synonymous with the Gilded Age itself. Morgan's office was the throne room. His decisions, delivered with an imposing, unblinking glare, carried the weight of national policy. These figures, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, were more than successful businessmen. They were economic emperors who leveraged a permissive legal and political environment combined with unprecedented technological advancement to engineer monopolies of
lived with it. The silk was a disguise, a beautiful, necessary camouflage for the moral compromises that built the American empire, leaving us to wonder if the magnificence of the Gilded Age was worth the soul it cost its architects. The Fifth Avenue drawing rooms of the Gilded Age were more than just spaces for polite society. They were the supreme courts of American aristocracy. Here, beneath the shimmering glow of bohemian crystal chandeliers and amidst the oppressive weight of French Renaissance decor, the fragile reputations of the newly rich were tried and judged. A whisper delivered over a glass of sherry could inflict more damage than a dozen muckraking newspaper articles. The moment the facade of piety and business genius began to crack, the moment of the first scandal, was a quiet, insidious event, marked not by shouts, but by a sudden, chilling silence. The subject on this particular evening was the meteoric rise of Elias Thorne, a railroad financier whose fortune had seemingly materialized overnight. His wife, Clara, sailed into the ball hosted by the doyenne of society, feeling the usual electric buzz of envy and admiration. But tonight, the air was different. The elaborate curtsies of the younger matrons were noticeably shallow, their smiles too fixed. Clara noticed that when she approached the velvet rope separating the inner circle, the group did not graciously part. Instead, conversation abruptly ceased, replaced by a wall of expectant yet distinctly hostile silence. She had been cut dead in the most elegant, horrifying way possible. The core of the scandal was not a simple bankruptcy. That was considered poor taste, but recoverable. This was a moral stain. The rumor, passed from one bejeweled whisper to the next, detailed Thorne's masterful yet utterly cynical manipulation of the state legislature regarding the Atlantic Coast Freight Charter. It was alleged that Thorne had engineered a sudden, deep market panic by feeding false information about the charter's failure to his rivals, only to swoop in at the last minute and purchase their distressed assets for pennies on the dollar, after he had secretly secured the charter through a massive, undisclosed political payoff. The result was a ruined handful of established, old-money families who now pointed directly at Thorne's new, gleaming fortune. "He didn't just win, dear," murmured Mrs. van der Heyden into her fan, pretending to be utterly absorbed by a portrait of a deceased Dutch ancestor. "He premeditated ruin, and for a paltry 30 million. The drawing room was the perfect echo chamber for this type of malice. The wives of the established Tycoons, the Rockefellers and Morgans, who had perfected the art of discreet corruption, found a delicious relief in morally indicting a new member whose greed was simply too clumsy, too obvious. Thorne's crime was not his avarice. It was his failure to conceal the operation behind the necessary layers of legal and social camouflage. As Thorne himself finally entered, his robust, smiling confidence evaporated under the collective, surgical gaze of the assembled elite. He was no longer a respectable tycoon. He was a social cipher. His lavish Fifth Avenue house now viewed less as a palace and more as a monument to recent dirty money. His wife left early, tears of humiliation hidden beneath her ermine cloak. Thorne stood alone near the enormous marble fireplace, the heat failing to warm the sudden chill that had fallen upon his life. The social verdict had been delivered. His money, however great, could not buy him immunity from the judgment of the drawing room. Tomorrow, the rumblings would reach the printing presses of the city, and the private shame of Fifth Avenue would become the public spectacle of the nation. But the true, unforgivable crime had already been committed here, in the cold, silent disapproval of his peers. The true machinery of the Gilded Age did not operate in the glittering marble halls of the New York Stock Exchange, nor under the public glare of a boardroom meeting. It ran in the quiet, smoke-filled, intensely private spaces far removed from accountability. The library of a Fifth Avenue mansion after midnight, the heavily guarded suite of the Waldorf Astoria, or, as was often
The mastermind of this particular deception was Silas Green, the self-proclaimed Western Rail King, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Green's latest, most ambitious project was the Transcontinental Shortcut, a proposed line through a forbidding, uninhabited stretch of mountain and desert. Publicly, Green touted the shortcut as the key to unlocking immense mineral wealth. Privately, he knew the route was economically ruinous. His true aim was not transportation, but stock inflation. Green issued massive amounts of railroad bonds and stock, feeding the market a steady stream of fabricated surveys and grandiose promises, creating a speculative frenzy that drove the paper value of the shortcut through the stratosphere. The genius of Green's conspiracy lay in manufacturing a reality that fueled public greed while silencing expert skepticism. The engineers who quietly warned that the route was impossible were swiftly fired and replaced by pliable loyalists. Local newspaper editors who dared question the project's viability received sudden, catastrophic cuts in advertising revenue, often from businesses indirectly controlled by Green himself. The atmosphere was thus saturated with an intense, suffocating suspicion. Everyone with a sensible mind knew the deal was unsound, yet the allure of the quick profit, relentlessly promoted by Green's propaganda, compelled thousands of small investors to buy in. They dismissed the rumors as mere professional jealousy, unable to believe that a man of Green's public standing would perpetrate such a massive, calculated fraud. The conspiracy culminated in a perfectly timed, engineered collapse. Just as the stock reached its impossible peak, after Green had successfully convinced several European banking houses to buy vast blocks of shares, he used a network of shell companies to quietly and methodically dump his entire personal holding onto the market. Days later, a seemingly innocuous report detailing the unexpected geological instability of a key mountain pass was leaked. The report was fabricated, but the effect was instantaneous and devastating. The stock market panicked. The price plunged to zero overnight, wiping out the life savings of farmers, merchants, and small-time speculators across the continent. When the dust settled, the government investigated, but the crime was legally immaculate. Green had merely sold stock based on his honest belief in the project, and the report had merely detailed an unforeseen natural disaster. Green's fortune, now secured and banked, was real, built not on the tracks he laid, but on the systematic destruction of faith and capital belonging to others. All that remained of the transcontinental shortcut was a few hundred miles of rusting, useless track winding into the desert, a silent monument to the ruthlessness of the great railway conspiracy and the undeniable truth that Silas Green's immense wealth was a fortune permanently forged in suspicion. In the Gilded Age, the greatest financial conspiracies required not only tycoons to plot them, but also meticulous men to record them. Alastair Finch was one such man, the chief confidential clerk and archivist for the powerful Union Trust Syndicate, a consortium of railroad and banking interests. Finch held the memory of the syndicate's crimes. The ledgers detailing every bribe, the coded telegrams outlining every hostile takeover, and the private letters confirming every backroom deal. He was a key figure, not for his wealth, but for his knowledge, and his very existence was a constant ticking threat to the new royalty. His subsequent vanishing act would become the era's most terrifying, unsolvable disappearance. The date was November 14th, 1888. Finch was scheduled to appear the next morning before a hostile Senate committee in Washington, one of the first serious attempts by the government to curb the Tycoons' overwhelming power. He had spent the last week in his subterranean vault, meticulously preparing the evidence. His wife stated he left his office on Wall Street precisely at 7 p.m., a man of unchanging habit. He was seen by the discussions, and most importantly, vaulted studies and private archives buried deep within the house's core, often accessible only via a hidden staircase or a discreet service elevator. These inner sanctums were the true operational centers where the confidential ledgers, stock certificates, and most likely records pertaining to figures like the disappeared Alistair Finch were kept under lock and key, far removed from the eyes of servants or inquisitive guests. Furthermore, the architecture addressed the Tycoons' pervasive paranoia. Having amassed wealth through cutthroat methods, they lived in constant fear of retribution, from labor unions, frustrated competitors, or even kidnappers targeting their children. The palaces reflected this anxiety. Windows were often narrow, barred, or placed high up on the walls, transforming the rooms into light-starved bunkers. The servants' quarters were deliberately separated and labyrinthine, ensuring the domestic staff, the only outsiders allowed in, could not easily observe the family's private movements or overhear sensitive conversations. A complex network of bells, buzzers, and internal telephones ensured the family maintained surveillance over every corner of their domain. The sheer scale of these palaces served a psychological purpose as well. The grand ballrooms and galleries, often copied directly from Versailles or similar European estates, were designed to intimidate. They were built not for comfort, but for the performance of power. A visitor or business rival standing in a 40-foot-high hall dwarfed by tapestries and marble columns was reminded, subliminally but effectively, that the host commanded resources and influence that transcended ordinary human scale. The architecture literally reinforced the social hierarchy. Ultimately, these oligarch palaces were physical embodiments of the Tycoon's dual persona, grandly public on the facade, yet utterly secluded and paranoid within. They were cages of their own making, magnificent, undeniable proof of their power, but also stark representations of their isolation, designed to keep the world out, not just for security, but to preserve the secrets and moral compromises that formed the very foundation of their colossal fortunes. The accumulation of colossal fortunes in the Gilded Age was only half the battle. The other, often more destructive half, was deciding how those fortunes would be dispersed. For the family of the late shipping and real estate magnate, Baron Augustus Vandermeer, the reading of his final testament became the flashpoint of a societal civil war. The Vandermeer inheritance, intended to secure his legacy, instead became the poison chalice, a legal document so deliberately complex and cruelly conceived that it sparked a decades-long feud that ripped through the very fabric of Fifth Avenue society. Baron Augustus Vandermeer, a man whose life was defined by control and meticulous planning, had viewed his three children, Eleanor, the society hostess, Robert, the dissolute gambler, and Julian, the quiet, scholarly youngest, not as heirs, but as final competitors. His death in 1895, expected yet sudden, initiated the crisis. The reading of the will took place in the suffocating silence of his massive mahogany library, attended by the three children and their families, their lawyers, and the Baron's longtime solicitor, Mr. Hayes. Mr. Hayes began by detailing the Baron's vast assets, railroads, shipping lines, and perhaps most valuable, prime real estate in Manhattan. Then came the devastating clauses. Instead of a straightforward division, the Baron had established a convoluted system of trusts and contingencies. The vast majority of the fortune, some 70%, was not to be distributed outright. Instead, it was placed into an Augustus Vandermeer Living Legacy Trust, which would be managed by all three siblings jointly. Crucially, any major financial decision regarding the trust required unanimous consent.
If the siblings failed to agree on the management or sale of any major asset for a period exceeding 6 months, the entire trust would dissolve, and the assets would be liquidated and donated entirely to a newly formed, deeply obscure charitable organization dedicated to teaching the moral failures of inheritance. The effect was instantaneous and venomous.
Calculating future deals, but reliving the past, carefully cross-referencing names, dates, and amounts, ensuring that his own memory of the corruption remained perfectly intact. He was his own most dedicated and most paranoid jailer. The room's contents were not all financial. In a heavy, leather-bound album on his desk lay the most personal and terrifying secret, proof of the tragic fate of the aforementioned Alistair Finch. Not a murder confession, but a meticulous record of the political machinations and discreet payouts that ensured Finch was silenced and his body never found. This documentation was not kept for posterity, but as a lever. It was Blackwell's insurance policy against any future betrayal by his surviving associates. He held the knowledge that connected them all to the unsolvable disappearance. The locked study was the ultimate embodiment of the Gilded Age paradox, a room dedicated to preserving secrets so vile that its existence betrayed the Tycoons' inner turmoil. It was the physical space where his immense financial triumphs directly met his questionable ethics. The room's silence was heavy, filled with the ghosts of ruined rivals and silenced witnesses. It was a space designed to protect his empire, yet it simultaneously imprisoned the man himself, forever binding Sterling Blackwell to the weight of his own unspeakable truths. The most absolute power the Gilded Age tycoons possessed was not their control over railroads or oil. It was their mastery over the very systems designed to hold them accountable. With wealth that often exceeded the national treasury, the new royalty found it remarkably simple to neutralize the greatest threat to their empires, the law. Buying the bench was the necessary final step in their rise, the cynical practice by which law and order bent to the richest, transforming American justice into a commodity available only to those who could afford the highest price. The process rarely involved blatant, easily traced suitcases of cash delivered to judges. The Tycoons preferred a sophisticated, systemic form of corruption, starting with the selection of the officials themselves. Tycoons like J.P. Morgan and Sterling Blackwell, our fictional financier, understood that the most effective judge was one who was already professionally indebted or philosophically aligned. They funded the political campaigns of favorable candidates for district attorney and state Supreme Court seats. They offered highly lucrative corporate retainers to rising young lawyers, grooming them for years before engineering their appointment to the bench. By the time the man in question donned the black robe, he was already an unofficial, deeply committed retainer of corporate interests. The true test of this system came during the infamous antitrust suit filed against Blackwell's Union Trust Syndicate. The suit, championed by a few brave, reform-minded prosecutors, threatened to dissolve the entire financial structure built upon the deal in the back room and the Great Railway Conspiracy. It was a high-stakes battle for the integrity of the nation's economy. The syndicate's defense was not built on legal arguments, it was built on access. The syndicate's lawyers, among the most expensive in the world, did not just present their case in court, they presented it in the quiet intimacy of the judge's private library. They wined and dined the Honorable Justice Harlan Crichton, filling his ears not with explicit demands, but with complex, coded arguments about the stability of the national economy, the danger of market disruption, and the need for judicious restraint in a growing nation. The message was clear. A ruling against the syndicate would not just hurt a company, it would hurt America, and the justice's future political aspirations would suffer accordingly. Justice Crichton never received a briefcase full of money. Instead, in persona, emphasizing the libraries they built and the universities they funded, thereby softening the image of the robber baron.
Furthermore, when a genuine scandal could not be entirely contained, for instance, a major labor strike or a political payoff that became too public, the Tycoons' controlled papers would instantly pivot to character assassination, portraying the reformer or the victim as an anarchist, a socialist, or a morally bankrupt schemer. The most potent tool of the press suppression was the power of distraction. Whenever a major legal or financial threat loomed, the papers would suddenly be saturated with stories about a massive new charitable donation, a lavish wedding, or the purchase of a $1 million European painting. The public's attention was constantly being pulled away from the complex truths of corruption towards the simple, dazzling allure of wealth and spectacle. Thus, while the Gilded Age was the age of print, the narrative was far from free. The vast fortunes of the Tycoons, used to buy the bench and now to buy the silence or compliance of the press, created a filtered reality for the American public. The true secrets of the Gilded Age were not kept because they were well hidden, but because the men who controlled the nation's wealth ensured that those who held the power of the printed word were too reliant or too intimidated to print the whole truth. Despite the Tycoons' best efforts at press suppression and buying the bench, public outcry occasionally reached a fever pitch that demanded action. The sheer brazenness of Sterling Blackwell's financial maneuvers and the persistent, chilling rumors surrounding the unsolvable disappearance of his archivist, Alistair Finch, finally forced the government's hand. A grand jury was impaneled, and after months of intense public pressure, it delivered a partial victory for reform. A failed indictment. This was the moment the veil of justice was fully lifted, exposing the trial that everyone knew was a farce. The specific charge brought against Blackwell was a narrow one, strategically chosen to avoid the complexity of his deeper political conspiracies. He was indicted for a minor case of perjury related to a specific document detailing his company's involvement in the initial stages of the Great Railway Conspiracy, a charge intended to open the door to larger revelations. The courtroom was packed. Outside, crowds gathered, hungry for a verdict that would symbolically punish the entire Gilded Age oligarchy for its sins. However, the courtroom itself quickly became the stage for a tragicomic spectacle. Blackwell's defense team, led by the legendary legal orator Clarence Darrow, deployed every possible delay tactic, objection, and technicality imaginable. The process was not about finding truth, it was about ensuring confusion. The prosecution was
could shatter their world if revealed. This ambient guilt, coupled with the pressure to maintain the impossibly opulent public facade established by their parents, led to widespread anxiety, addiction, and emotional distance. They were burdened by the constant need for press suppression, not for their own crimes, but for their ancestors. Many heirs rebelled, using their unearned money for conspicuous consumption or self-destruction, desperate to feel something real outside the confines of their inherited identities. Others became compulsive philanthropists, driven by an unconscious need to atone for the original sins of their fathers, frantically trying to use the generational wealth to scrub clean the generational trauma. The curse of the tycoon was ultimately this: the wealth that bought them absolute power also bought them absolute moral vacuum. It ensured their families would never have to work, but it also ensured they would never know peace. The secrets that had been zealously guarded behind the high walls of the oligarch palaces manifested in the children as neuroses, addiction, and despair. The greatest legacy of the Gilded Age tycoons was not their soaring financial empires, but the deep, internal scars borne by the subsequent generations, proving that a fortune forged in suspicion always exacts a spiritual toll. The Gilded Age had long faded into history, its titans interred beneath monuments of their own design, and the sensationalism of the failed indictment and the unsolvable disappearance reduced to footnote status in history books. Yet, the moral compromises and hidden secrets still echoed. It fell to a new generation, specifically to Dr. Evelyn Reed, a meticulous historian driven by curiosity to embark on the archivist's quest, digging up the dirt decades later. Her mission? To prove that the immense generational wealth of the Blackwell and Vandermeer families was built on more than mere ruthlessness. It was built on crime. Evelyn's initial focus was the mysterious disappearance of Alistair Finch, the syndicate archivist. The police files, accessible after 75 years, were predictably sparse and tainted by the influence of buying the bench. But Evelyn knew the key wasn't in the public record, it was in the private ones. Her quest led her not to grand libraries, but to dusty county courthouses and the forgotten family papers of the Tycoons' long-dead lawyers, the minor players who had been paid to keep the major secrets. She began by meticulously cross-referencing the official, published company ledgers, the sanitized versions created after the press suppression, with the private financial records of the legal firms that had represented Sterling Blackwell during his high-profile trials. She found curious, repeated payments labeled simply consulting fees, Western affairs, coinciding precisely with the period of the Great Railway Conspiracy. The sums were too large to be ordinary legal costs, hinting at a systematic, extra-legal mechanism of profit. The breakthrough came unexpectedly in the decaying estate of the late Justice Critchen's distant cousin, the very relative whose financial elevation had secured the judge's favor. Evelyn discovered an enormous, neglected collection of correspondence. Hidden deep within a box marked Unpublished Sermons was a series of encrypted letters written between the cousin and an anonymous trustee B. Using a cipher key, based on a then-popular parlor game, Evelyn decoded the letters. They revealed the true nature of the consulting fees. They were untraceable payoffs, thinly disguised as stock options, intended to manipulate the legislative process necessary for the deal in the back room. Most crucially, the letters contained a cryptic reference to the master key and the study's final drawer, a direct allusion to Blackwell's infamous locked study. The clue pointed not to the secrets of the past, but to a physical object hidden in the present. Evelyn theorized that after Blackwell's death, his lawyers, fearing the truth more than the will itself, had quietly removed the original incriminating private vault of unspeakable truths and deposited it in the one place they knew would be safe from both law and family. A small, forgotten safety deposit box held under the name of an inactive, defunct shell corporation in Delaware. Evelyn's archivist's quest was not about revenge, it was about truth. The money was untouchable, protected by layers of trusts and legal statutes, but the history was not.